and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very, very certain that your interest is going to be rewarded. So now I would like to introduce Professor Steve Yano from St. John's University. Woohoo!
So, thank you, Sophie. Thanks to Budapest Open for inviting me to speak. The last time I did this lecture was 2 years ago at another university. And this time is different because I managed to get a cold. So I hope you bear with me during the course of it. I might sniffle a bit. It just add to the ambiance of the enjoyment of the talk, maybe. Think of it in maybe a positive way. So I apologize for that. And 2 years ago, it was a double-billed talk. The other lecturer, Alfred Snyder, a friend of mine and friend to debate, and passed away in December, very suddenly. And it's very strange to be here and to not know that he would peek his little face in, because he never came to my talks. But I went to his, and I guess that was our friendship. And to see his little face peek in, it made me realize I maybe had about 10 minutes left. And to not have that is something I'm going to miss. And I'm thinking about him in this talk tonight. Before I get into the heart of the paper that I want to present about an improvised suggestion for teaching debate, I think I maybe need to give a little bit of background about where I come from, the United States, and how debating at the university level is there, which is very, very different than the way debating is treated at the European academies, European universities. It's a very different experience for the students, and it's one that I think I can give some context very quickly before we get into the heart of the paper so that you can understand sort of where I'm coming from with my ideas, and maybe it will give something fruitful for us to talk about tonight. So one of the biggest, I put it into three categories of differences between the European debate model and the American debate model. And there's a lot of history here. In fact, the whole lecture could be about the history of collegiate debating in America and why is it so different than European debating at the university level. Why is it so different? That's something we can speculate on. But the biggest difference is that debating was introduced to the United States in the colonial times in the 17th century with the very first universities that were formed in the U.S. colonies, the British colonies, namely. And it was a part of the curriculum. And that lingered in the United States in a way that it did not when there were reforms made to European universities from the 1600s into the 1700s, into the 1800s, which coincided with the development of inexpensive book publication. And that changed the entire layout of the university in Europe. But somehow this idea of debating being a part of the curriculum remained in the United States. I think that curricular connection is one of the biggest differences. Faculty-driven debate is normal in the United States, which is a faculty member's responsibility is to run the debate society, to teach the debate society as a club, not as a credit class or anything like that, but as a club that usually meets in the evening, and they do practices, and the faculty member makes the arrangements for them to travel and all this. And in Europe, these organizations are student-run. And so I call this the difference between a faculty-driven debate and a debate that's driven in faculty ignorance or faculty unawareness that this is happening. Very few faculty at non-American universities are even aware that there's a debating society. They might know a little bit about it, but they certainly don't attend the practices. They certainly don't teach the debate students. And that's a major difference. So part of my scholarship and part of my duties at St. John's is to run the debate society. I'm the director of the debate society. That's why I was hired for my faculty position, was because of my experience doing this. So it's one of my primary responsibilities. And that's a big difference. It's hard to imagine European universities would have such a model. And that's very American. There are some student-driven societies, but they're quite rare. And the other difference is that modern debating, the modern American university, is co-curricular as opposed to extracurricular. Extracurricular debating is like the attitude that most European universities and European students and faculty would have about debate, which is that it's a fun thing that you do in your spare time. And it's something that you do if you have spare time and you're able to do it. Most debating societies in the United States are argued as being co-curricular, which means they have something to do with the larger curriculum. There's some reason that debating is sponsored by the university, and it's hopefully a way to dovetail with the larger curricular goals of the various colleges and the various faculty. So one of the things that is very normal for American professors to do and for American students to accept is to have a debate in class as an assignment, as an activity, as something like that, instead of it just being a fun thing that one does on the weekend and nobody really knows about it. University money is often put, a lot of university money is often put towards the Debate Society as a program. So we have a budget from the provost office, and that budget is for traveling to events like this and competing primarily, or whatever I see fit to do with it, within reason, of course, to do that. So those are some of the big differences. There has to be, I think, in my research, and one of the lines I'm going to push today, is I think there has to be some value added to the university for debate to matter. And I think that's a conversation that doesn't often happen. I think debate societies, along with their universities, kind of have this respectful distance that they keep from each other. And the debate society doesn't communicate everything that they're doing to the faculty and administration. The faculty and administration are not that interested in what the students are doing as far as debate society goes. But I think there has to be some value added, and I think we're at an interesting time, an interesting place to really examine what that value added could be. And that's why I started working on this paper. I've been working on this paper for about a year, and it's going really well. And it's just sort of about the teaching of debate and thinking about it in a different way. Argumentation as a field is it's really gaining steam in Europe, and that's mostly due to, I think, in Europe, the work at the University of Amsterdam, Frans van Imeren and his colleagues, who are doing work in pragmadialectical argumentation theory, which is quite a mouthful. It's a nice long word. Almost not an English word. It's long enough to, I think, be a German word. But pragmadialectical argumentation theory is sweeping European studies, and it's approaching argumentation as an object of study from continental philosophy. And that is making argumentation become incredibly popular as an object of study in Europe. But it has not been influenced by the tradition that I'm talking about tonight, the American debating tradition. In America, it's sort of been bottom-up, whereas in Europe, it's happening top-down, where philosophy is starting to say argumentation, political argumentation, argumentation in the parliament, argumentation in campaigns is becoming an important object to study and an object of great interest to study. And that's a big change from it just sort of being like dismissed, or for it being the proper object of study for government faculty or politics faculty, or maybe even psychology faculty, depending on how your election's going. I know in my country we have a lot of election discourse that's very appropriate for psychology faculty, I think, to look at. But we won't talk about that tonight. I think we've heard enough about that. But I think you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, the importance of the bottom-up approach is that it went from a practice that students are doing in order to learn other materials, and then it has become something that is somewhat of a scholarly connection. Now, it's not fully accepted in the United States for it to be a scholarly connection at all, and that's the line I'm sort of pushing tonight. So, I hope that tonight, what I'm going to push, and I hope that what you'll agree with me on at the end, is that the presence of a debate society at your university, or at the campus, or here at CEU, is a vast, really important untapped resource for accessing some of these nice things that one can get in the classroom and one can get from students that might frustrate us as faculty, or frustrate us as students, or frustrate us as postgraduate students working on something that we're trying to learn. What I hope to convey is that debate is its own separate, legitimate object of study. I don't think debate gets treated that way. I think debate gets treated as a place where something worth studying in politics comes out, or something worth studying in rhetoric comes out, or something worth studying in logic or argumentation comes out. It's like a vehicle for the important information. I want to push that aside. I think it's important to study those things. And I think it's important to study argumentation that appears in debates, like they do in Amsterdam, or like they do at the University of Ontario in Windsor, Canada, where they study this, or like they do, and many philosophy faculty over the world study argumentation. But I want debate to be at the same level as appropriate object of study. What I hope to convey is the importance of looking at debate as its own legitimate object of study. This is not using it as a whole for the analysis of argumentation, as American and European scholars often do. that work, I believe, overdetermines the nature and understanding of debate. Debate's importance for society is something worth studying and is not to be dismissed. It is vital to democracy and also vital to the university as part of university ecology and its position in a largely consumer capitalist global environment that exists and I think is also expanding. One of the key examples for the incredible importance of debate is, I think, the realm of critical thinking, and I want to talk about critical thinking a bit. Some of you might be familiar with the scholarship on critical thinking. There's a lot of it, and there's very little agreement between scholars as to what critical thinking is, how to measure it, what it looks like, how we know if somebody did it. I heard someone do it once in Milwaukee, this kind of thing. The ease of dismissal of the practices of critical thinking is the problem that I am very interested in, which is students, and if you're a teacher of some kind, hopefully there's a few of you here, students are very good at critical thinking in the classroom. You show them what to do, they're able to do it on an exam, they're able to do it in a paper, but once they leave the university, it seems like those practices are for the classroom. They're heavily marked as classroom appropriate behavior. But when they go out into the public, or when they go to the polls, or when they go to the political rally, it all vanishes. Why is that? This is a huge problem for us. And I wrote this paper as a way of sort of thinking through that problem. I've also written other things about the idea of critical thinking and debate. But I think the 21st century battle cry of faculty is students need to critically think better. And this is something that's global. I think this is one thing, it's very, very unusual. If you've ever been to a faculty meeting, or a departmental meeting of any kind, it's very unusual to get a small amount of faculty to agree on much. But universally, I think most faculty around the world would agree that students need better critical thinking ability. Hands down, whatever country you go to, whatever faculty you speak to, whatever students you encounter, this is the sort of the battle cry. But we do not see the relative social or political pressure coming out of that in our politics or in our society. We don't see the pressure. Why is that? And I think it's because critical thinking is inappropriately thought about. The situation is best summarized in a quote by Rod Serling. You know Rod Serling, I'm dating myself here. Twilight Zone. He's the producer and writer of The Twilight Zone, weird American TV show from the 1960s. Rod Serling, a philosopher in his own right, I guess, he said, "What we see in the United States is that we teach people how to decide between 15 different kinds of breakfast cereal, but they cannot think." In other words, we teach people how to be excellent consumers, and we call it critical thinking. As Henry Giroux has written, schools teach that there is little more to democratic participation than being an active and smart consumer. That kind of stings a bit when I read that in Giroux. I'm like, wow. It's like this is what has grafted itself onto appropriate democratic participation. I got a good deal today. I saved money. I met my budget at the grocery store. These kind of things for young people have become the signs of a good, ethical, democratic citizen. There's a sort of civic pride connected with being a savvy consumer, and it's connected to the way education is performed across educational institutions. And this performance after university or after education becomes, in toto, the way to be a good citizen in an advanced, capitalist, democratic society. The model of agency that comes from such critical consumer thinking, as I call it, I think there's a difference between critical thinking and critical consumer thinking, is well explained by Michel Foucault in his essay Walking the City, and his larger book, The Practices of Everyday Life is the English title. I don't know the French one. But he discusses the relationship between the tactical and the strategic. The strategic is the overarching obvious way that life is organized by ideology. The sidewalks and the streets of a city, as he writes this essay, he's standing on the top of the World Trade Center on the 108th floor, the observation deck of the World Trade Center, looking down. And the streets and the sidewalks control the appropriate means and direction of walking. The tactical is the sense of play, or perhaps we can use the Deleuzian term assemblage, of the choices individuals make while engaged in a strategy. The strategic would be to color inside the lines, which instruction we give to the child. And the tactical would be the child's desire to color either back and forth, or color in spirals, or to use two colors, all while staying inside the lines. What is important to Desserteau's analysis is the agency that comes out of it. That there's not a possibility within purely strategic systems to just draw a line across the pre-assigned page, something a child would do without those borders. Combine this with the sense that one is a critical thinker if one shops well, or spots a good bargain, or makes a good choice on internet service, and you can see how the individual is well positioned to feel really great and really feel really free inside a very constrained system of ideology. To expand critical thinking, and I think most of our critical thinking practices are on the level of the tactical. Like, how do we work within that larger system to make good things happen? To expand critical thinking beyond it to where it can address the strategic level becomes central to a democratic ethos. We require a reconception of critical thinking. And this is where universities can do a great service to larger society by, I think, teaching debate curricularly and adapting a little bit more of this American flavor of the curricular attachment to debating. I believe we have to reconsider critical thinking as a culture instead of a skill set. To do this, new understandings of debate, rhetoric, and communication are required. More than that, they are necessary prerequisites to the sort of critical analysis of ideology and institution that we want our students and our fellow citizens to be capable of. But we cannot consider debate or critical thinking as a mere capacity. We must find a new metaphor for it. This is why I'm sharing this particular paper with you tonight. We should recover debate's role not as a capacity or a skill set, but as an art, not as a tool for the evaluation of the political, or a site for the archaeology of argumentation or logic, or a test firing range for new reasons that support our beliefs. It must be practiced and it must be heard as an art, so that the ability to appreciate a culture of critical thinking is something that people will accidentally practice all the time in their daily lives. So now I'm going to get into the formal paper, and it deals a lot with the particularities of the American system of debate, but I think you'll still get a kick out of it. Debate history in the United States is very weird because it's always been connected to faculty. Faculty directing it, faculty running it, and that comes with a lot of problems too. Huge problems. And the students are like, tell me what to do. Tell me what to say. Show me what argument wins. Whereas in the student-driven society, you could say it's much more democratic or egalitarian, where they're all sort of teaching each other. There's more peer education, which is quite a buzzword in educational theory these days. The history of college debate in the United States is an event that can be described as radically self-altering. 100 years ago, a primary concern for collegiate debate was how big of a crowd you were going to draw to the debates. A. Craig Baird, the professor at Bates College who started the still continuing U.S.-American debate exchange, which happens annually, just finished again in the U.S., where British debaters come and tour the United States and debate a series of contests across American universities and then go back home. A. Craig Baird muses that British debate, or the BP format, which is what this tournament's going to be in, would not be good for Americans because, quote, it is hard to conceive of audiences in considerable numbers following these debates year after year. Howard Woodward, another American debate professor from 100 years ago, decides that after his debaters have chosen the topic of whether socialism would be good for the United States, that this would not be able to be fairly evaluated by any American judge, so we should proceed to debate without judges. Quote, because the topic would be an exceedingly profitable one to study. Since securing a fair decision was not possible, interest in debating the topic won out. But even without judges, Woodward calms us. He says, quote, the audience was at least up to the average size. Oddly, for contemporary collegiate debaters, the average size would be the panel of judges, your opponents, and in the case of an elimination round, the tournament participants who had lost and had not gone home yet. Maybe 15, 20 people. Crowd size did not limit itself to the actual debate contest. College debate created a large market for its discourse in the United States, expanding the debate audience to those broadly interested in argumentative exchange. During the mid-20th century, W.H. Norton, publisher, published a series of books annually that contained the most interesting speeches, outlines, and briefs of the past year's intercollegiate debates. These books were bestsellers. Every library had them. Such resources, quote, enabled debaters, this is quoting Claudia Keenan, who's done the most research on these W.H. Norton books. I collect them myself, and it's bizarre to think that debate speeches would be best-selling books that every school library would have to buy year after year after year. Very bizarre to us, right? Such books, quote, enabled debaters to become highly skilled researchers by teaching them how to locate evidence within a growing literature, putting them in the vanguard as information became an essential commodity in many fields. So there's a cultural historical connection to these books as well, as we sort of moved into what we now call the information economy, the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Yeah, there's a cultural connection there, I believe, as well. These books represented a moment where traditionally obscure American debate found itself entwined with emerging research technologies, books, publication, paperbacks, things like this. It seems alien today that debaters would be, through their normal practices of debating, responsible for a best-selling book series. It made Norton a lot of money. It would be the equivalent of having YouTube videos of competitive debates make millions of dollars through ad revenue. What happened to this world? What happened to these collections of intercollegiate debates? What happened to the transcripts of the United States National Debating Tournament published by the National Textbooks Company? No longer published. These texts no longer hold much interest for those outside of people directly teaching and competing in debate. Debate has turned inward, referencing itself as the measure of what is excellent argument. That's the problem. In our argumentation courses, now that's another weird thing about America too, is that we have a course you can take called debate, and then we have a course you can take called argumentation. What's the difference? Big differences. If you go to the University of Amsterdam and you talk to Van Ameren and his colleagues, they'll say huge differences. Right? You come to the US, a rhetoric professor like yourself might say, oh, they're about the same thing. So there's lots of differences in the scholarly. The scholars don't agree. We have these conventions all the time and nobody agrees, but they're lots of fun. I like it. I have a debate background, so I like it. But this inward turn is really a danger, a real problem for debate, that we reference our own competitions as for what good argumentation is. Or we reference the past competitions or speakers that people really like as what makes a good argument. Attention is turned inward, and it's a subject in itself, hermetically sealed, as opposed to being marked as a discourse shared with and by others. How we got to this position is that we think of argumentation or debate as a type of closed system rather than an open system, as a skill set rather than an art. In this essay, I argue we should, or in this paper tonight, argue we should reimagine our argumentation curriculum and debate curriculum as the teaching of rhetorical production. Instead of teaching it as a thing, we should teach it as an act that requires others, is for others, and is best understood and practiced outside of itself. As the scholar Wayne Broccaridi wrote, quote, "The idea of argument is an open concept. Seeing it as an open concept is consistent with the ideas that arguers are people, that people change, and that the filtering concepts people use when they make perceptions also change." Constituting our curriculum around argument as produced, around people producing it, might be a way to put the teaching of debate or argumentation back into the public as it was last century. Argumentation and debate being structured mostly about itself and the rules constructed for its own self-evaluation and the rules constructed for its own tournament evaluation for competition might not be the most attractive set of rules to deal with in promoting debate to a larger public. The analog that I'm going to speak about is from music education, specifically the pedagogical approach towards teaching jazz players how to play jazz. This is the outline of a new curriculum for teaching debate that I propose here tonight. And I want to suggest what it would look like and what the major differences would be from our normal classroom activities, normal being in the U.S. I don't know how often European universities have a course on argumentation outside of the University of Amsterdam or debate course. I don't know how frequent that is. I would say it's very infrequent, I would think, but you can teach me maybe about that after the presentation. So, argumentation and debate pedagogy has always been considered valuable, necessary, and effective as a part of university curriculum, but not at the scope that it was. I think this is from the separation of argumentation from practice, from an art, from a performance, and more towards a philosophical concept. As Charles Willard explains in his book on argumentation, the turn towards teaching argument as a set of receptive critical practices has diminished the scope and scale of what teaching, debate, and argument can do. Quoting Charles Willard, "Argumentation historically rose as a skills pedagogy. Theory followed practice. Higher order concepts evolved from the pedagogical repertoire. Criticism came to describe pedagogy in thinking, speaking, and listening skills, and their putatively more sophisticated uses by critics. But the former has so constrained the latter as to produce a 50-year tradition of inconsequential work. Our theories find only their audience in the classroom. Our criticism speaks only to us. The field seems condemned to underestimate the scope and importance of its principles and their applicability. Applicability towards. I lost my place. This is the problem with, reading off of something like this. Their ability and their applicability to public and intellectual problems. The horizons of argument criticism are so circumscribed that we define the problem of the public sphere in terms of elementary expositional mistakes, as if we can adjudicate the abortion controversy by fixing fallacies or the nuclear power debate by correcting inconsistencies. I think this is how argumentation taught from the perspective of logic or as a philosophical object really fails, because these large public debates are much messier than what we would strip out of it for the benefits of a competition. Much messier. And the idea that you would think that if someone's empowered to identify 12 fallacies, that they could go out and participate in the abortion debate in the United States or in the nuclear power debate that lots of governments in the world are participating in at the moment, they would really, really be behind in the way the policymakers would debate that. Willard describes a pedagogy that has lost its potential. We are far removed from Woodward's simple corrective of an open public debate for the purpose of investigating the question of socialism. Willard's concern remains unanswered as semester after semester we teach argumentation courses where the fallacies must be learned and deployed correctly, and the tests of evidence must have multiple newspaper editorials ground through them in order to show students how argumentation's critical principles reinforce argumentation's critical principles. In the early 20th century, students of argumentation and debate riffed off one another, finding inventive possibility in the audience, the topic, and in the moment of argument. Information was consulted as a starting point, not critically assessed for correctness as an ending point of the study. We need to return to that early 20th century moment and produce a productive pedagogy of argumentation, one that emphasizes student creativity, student creation, and deployment of arguments, rather than the assessment of arguments made elsewhere and imported into the classroom. Let me talk about the pedagogical model for why jazz improvisation, or the art, the idea of having students riff off each other in arguments, is much more valuable than having them critically assess argumentation as an object and write something about it or identify fallacies in it. Jonathan Freeman wrote an essay a few years ago about how to teach legal ethics in American law school. And he argues that law school is best thought of as a manipulative paradigm. That is, most of what the legal profession requires is a knowledge of the law and how to move it into configurations and out of configurations. He writes, quote, "Law schools may teach legal ethics for the same reason that they teach any other subject in the curriculum, to explicate the doctrine, or more specifically, to enable students to make arguments on either side of any given dispute arising in that area of the substantive law. In short, one might refer to this as enabling students to manipulate a doctrine. But legal ethics are not about the manipulation of an outside doctrine. They are about equipping the student for the unforeseen obstacles to come in a legal career." Quoting him again, "Though it does indeed aim to teach students how to think about ethics, profession ethics education also aims to guide students' action, or at least aims to have their ethical thinking guide their action. In short, one might refer to this as encouraging students to assimilate the ethical norms." This distinction in types of teaching is one that we can sum up in the terms of Kenneth Burke as providing instruction on how to operate equipment and providing that equipment for living. A manipulative pedagogy assumes that the field is set. It's not set up for play. It's set up in the sense of a mathematical function. There are all the variables and numbers that will be present in that function that you will need. What students learn is how to make a particular combination happen, or how to prevent a combination from occurring. At the same time, students are learning how to evaluate the quality of particular combinations, and whether or not one combination is superior to another within the rules of that set. So this is normal sort of law school education, but it's also sort of been exported onto argumentation pedagogy and onto debate pedagogy, and that is a problematic exporting, is my argument. This is not a negative critique of manipulative pedagogy. I think manipulative pedagogy is great, but it's great if the subject is right for it. It's used in a lot of fields, and it's great for the fields. But the most important thing to understand about manipulative pedagogy, for my argument tonight, is that it works on the assumption that one is teaching something that is set or fixed in what it contains. Of course, in law, you might say, well, in the legal field, new laws are made all the time, and the Supreme Court of the United States issues these decisions that change the law and semi-annual rulings and things like this. But this is accounted for in manipulative pedagogy because the set contains the possibilities of laws altering, or for a new law to be introduced, for law is the category upon which the manipulation is based. In other words, something could not enter legal practice as a valid, it wouldn't enter their frame of vision as something worth looking at without being a law. The pedagogy assumes a familiarity of genetic traits between them. Something radical, something outside of the understanding of law would never enter the fray. It would be ignored at best, dismissed as being irrelevant to what lawyers do. Assimilative pedagogy, on the other hand, assumes the set is in the constant state of being made. This making is also a reassessment in each case. In the domain of ethical practices of law, this makes sense. Not every ethically questionable situation can be mapped and presented to students with the correct answer. Instead, what the teaching must look like is one of approach, ascertainment, and acceptance or rejection. I choose these terms, these aren't Freeman's terms, these are my terms here. I chose those terms because they most clearly define three rather blurred collections of practices that are involved in assimilative pedagogy. The distinctions are not firm, not clear. Perhaps they could be thought of like Joseph Wenzel's understanding of three argument types. Wenzel is a famous argumentation scholar from the US who said that argument is used for three different things in societies. It can be considered, or scholars have treated it this way. It can be a product, we can make an argument. It can be a process, we can have an argument. Or it can be a procedure, like in a courtroom, or when you go to get your traffic ticket taken care of or something like that. You have to go through this argumentative sort of procedure. Or like the American presidential debate model, which is being exported around the world as something that politicians, this horrible hazing ritual that we all have to go through, with politicians standing up in this weird American format, and then they even do it for fun, like Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage in the UK did it about the EU like a couple of years ago. It was bizarre. Why would they choose that model? I don't know. It's a model that generates, we can talk about presidential debating as well after, but it's a model that generates revenue is why it's popular. It makes money. There's like everything else in advanced capitalism. Understanding, well actually I'm going to skip that part I think. So improvisation, let's go to the next part of my thing. So I think that instead of thinking of debate or argument as manipulative pedagogy, we must think of it as assimilative. That is, there's no full set of all arguments that you're going to hear. At the University of Windsor in Ontario, Canada, where they study what they call informal logic. They're philosophers there, and they study rhetoric and argumentation. They say that they study fallacies, and they're always writing about new fallacies, and discovering them, testing old fallacies. And they say, how many fallacies are there? And a lot of people would either say, those scholars say on an extreme, they say there are no fallacies at all. The term has no descriptive or any kind of potential as something that a reasonable person would address. And there are as many fallacies as there are arguments, which is this approaching infinity sort of number. Very strange. Right? Most people would say there's about maybe 25 or 30, but some people, if you really worked on it, say, well, maybe there are 50 formal fallacies. I don't know. It really depends on what you read and what you believe. But the idea that the set is always being remade and made and things are being poured into it and things are leaking out of it is the important part. Now, improvisation, I think instead of improvisation and performance, instead of acceptance and critical evaluation, is much, much more important to teaching debate than anything else. But improvisation is something difficult to understand, and it's difficult to define due to its dual personality as something both new and recognizable as old. It is outside of the predictable precisely because of its direct reference to the expected. One improvises off of a piece of music that you already know. So you recognize the improvisation because of its familiarity as new. Sounds like a paradox, but Santi and Illiterati, that's actually the person's name, that's a cool... I immediately wanted to go and change my surname to Illiterati. Santi and Illiterati address this definitional issue quite well when they write, quote, in improvisation, shared practices, steeped in culture and history, are intertwined, yet constantly exposed to the force of innovation. Respect and transgression, two apparently opposing but intricately bound concepts, are combined in an emergent response to a present situation. From this perspective, tradition may be considered a standard that is built on previous transgressions. Similarly, we could also state that improvisation works alongside tradition by applying rules and standards while continuously breaking those rules and standards to produce new forms. These emergent forms are governed by ongoing action, and it is exactly this governance that allows tradition to become a repertoire of the strange and of ideas which become the norm. Thinking about an improvisational assimilative pedagogy seems natural for those who are interested in teaching argumentation and debate, even more so for those teaching argumentation from the rhetorical tradition. Situational response based on public memories that the audience shares are what create valuable and pertinent meaning. Over time, those ruptures become the new meanings that future audiences subscribe to as expectations when they attend a political event. Setting the stage for the future arguer to take up and use a part of his or her approach, convincing that audience. But don't we already do this in our classrooms? Attention to audience and situation seems legally mandated to appear in any argumentation textbook. So you take an argumentation textbook and look through it, it's always about, go evaluate your audience. Make sure you adapt to your audience. Make sure you adapt to the situation. Is it dinner time? You should be more entertaining. You shouldn't just read the whole time off your iPad. Things like that. That may or may not be relevant. But This is the kind of thing that but surprisingly, it's not necessarily the case. Argumentation pedagogy, although potentially connected to improvisation, teaches it in ways that are anti-improvisation or possibly manipulative in scope. Freeman noted in the law school curriculum ideas such as role-playing and the standards of judgment in ethical legal situations don't often get there. So in argumentation pedagogy, one of the most popular things is role-playing, which I'm very critical of because it's sort of manipulative pedagogy and also distracts. Gordon Mitchell has written the most about, he's at the University of Pittsburgh, he's written the most about role-playing, and he positions it against competitive and adversarial debating role models as a better way of doing debate. He writes, "The adversarial nature of such debates injects a competitive or even combative element into the classroom that tends to polarize discussion, penalize communicative cooperation, and alienate some students. As an alternative, he suggests role-play debates, where students, quote, engage in simulated dialogues with each other, working to fashion statements that fit their character sketches and draw creatively from assigned readings and background knowledge." Role-playing has a long history of involvement in educational enterprises of all kinds, traced by Mitchell to include such things as the school play and the use of stakeholder perspectives and exercises, such as choosing who will be chosen to survive in particular situations. This exercise is sort of like, you have a lifeboat, it only has 6 seats, who are you going to take, those kind of things. Mitchell believes role-playing can solve both the problems inherent in the traditional classroom, reliance on Freirean critiqued banking models, and antagonistic, uncomfortable, competitive debate, which may alienate students. While role-playing does seem more inclusive of the contest-averse members of the class, it's a very clear example of manipulative pedagogy attempting to look like assimilative or improvisational art. Freeman assesses the use of role-playing as manipulative, taking the focus away from assimilation. He writes, "The nomenclature of role-play suggests the purpose of the exercise is to play a role. With such linguistic guidance, students often understandably concentrate on their classmates or their own facility in playing that role. For amateur actors or non-actors, such facility is usually exercised and perceived through attempts to mimic a stereotyped notion of what the role entails. Students may perceive a role play as requiring them to play a role external to themselves, and one in which they believe themselves unlikely to find themselves in the future. They thus may distance themselves from the experience even as they're engaged in it." So the problem with role-playing is that it tries to make argumentation assimilative by saying, look, there's all these different people and these stakeholders, but it makes those roles or those types of people, refugee, diplomat, prime minister of Iran, whatever the role-playing is, fixed and manipulative and stereotypical. And the students focus on that and trying to play that role as they've understood it through international corporate media, more than they look at the arguments or more than they connect to that they could be in this situation themselves one day. And Freeman says that the only role appropriate for his students is that of attorney, and I tend to agree. But in an argumentation classroom or in debate, there's lots of different roles we can be, but that role would be something more like democratic citizen. So this is why I'm concerned about role play, and also concerned for those of you who are contemporary VP practitioners of our shift more towards emotions, like as a feminist, this house would, as a member of this house would, because those are sort of leaning more towards that and sort of dealing with dismissing the problems and the complications of improv assimilative learning to make it look as if that's been taken off the table, and now we're dealing with a fixed set of knowns about how these people are, how they think, who they are, etc. The forging of a link between the self and the situation covered is essential towards creating a successful future performance that is not based on manipulating a set of rules to get a desired result. Freeman is talking about ethics, but it's clear that the creation of students of argument who perform the manipulation of principles as if they were rules in order to persuade others is of the same genus. Role-playing further reinforces this idea. This disconnects the student from the notion that he or she will not have a flat set of perspectives from which to draw or craft the best answer to the controversy that faces them. Instead, one must assemble a strategy from what they have available. So, what must assimilative pedagogy contain? Let's move on to some of the jazz stuff, which I think might be kind of cool to think about. So, when I started looking for assimilative, improvisational, pedagogy, argumentation, I found nothing. I couldn't find people have written a sentence on it. But when I just started looking for improvisational pedagogy, I found very little. But then when I started looking in what music teachers had written, I got bowled over. there were too many things. This is all that these people write about, is how to teach people how to be improvisational, artistic, creative, and to riff off of one another. So there's a huge amount of literature on this that I can't even begin to do any kind of respect towards. But I have found some interesting ideas to think about what debate would look like in the classroom and what debate would look like taught as something that was more about creativity and production rather than critical assessment. Are you using those skill sets? Are you doing this classroom exercise correctly? Have a nice day, which is, I think, how it gets taught most of the time. Jazz improvisation is based on playing. That is, most jazz teachers and jazz musicians are encouraged to participate in the creation and performance of music. The first step is immersion, or exposure, and is coupled with encouragement to play along with what's playing. This not only shows the students they have the potential to be advocates, perhaps the only role-playing role permissible in this model, but it also begins the assimilation of a variety of argumentation techniques. Technique is an incredibly important term in musical improvisation pedagogy, and not just because it allows the musician to play the song. It has key rhetorical implications as well, for the recognition of improvisation as meaningful. Improvisation in the pedagogy of jazz comes from the emergence of a situation that calls upon the advocate to generate and perform an argumentative response. The advocate looks to the techniques to cobble together elements that work well within the situation as presented. When this is delivered, attention is never called towards the rightness of the technical move, but the importance of the situation in the genesis of the measured, persuasive, and correct utterance. As students mimic the arguments of the masters, they also learn a number of techniques and approaches from our theory. This gestures back to the pre-argumentation handbook debaters in the early 20th century that I mentioned earlier in the talk, who, quote, had to, and this is quoting the scholar who does the most on that, who is, well, I don't have it here, but I can give you the site at the end, but they had consulted collections of great speeches and books about oratory and argumentation. So they're not using sort of a set of things that they're using to craft their arguments from, or the official book or the official handbook. They're going to many different resources to sort of play their song, to riff off of these different things to make their argument compelling, instead of a passive, more passive response, which is, am I doing this right? Is this in accordance with the rules? And this is like, and this is a critique, if you listen to my podcast or you read my blog and stuff, this is like my critique of the Malaysian document would be here too, right? The Malaysia Worlds document that the conveners of Worlds made in Malaysia and said, this is how you debate, and now it encourages this passive manipulative relationship to debating rather than an active assimilist one that encourages creativity of reaching out. Instead, we're just reaching in, evaluating ourselves on our own standards, evaluating the quality of a debate based on the quality of another contest debate ad infinitum. This was soon to pass as the rise of the debate handbook ushered in, and the same thing has happened in American debate. The rise of the debate handbook and the rise of the debate rule book has caused people to sort of distance themselves and become more and more irrelevant to the public and more irrelevant to the way deliberation and argumentation happen in public, in democratic, in advanced capitalist democratic orders. Assimilating the great speeches, the great orator's advice, and other emblems created a well from which the student, ruminating on the correct response to the situation, could put together something that not only adapted but contributed to the future possibilities of argumentative production for other speakers. The traditional argumentation class places emphasis on invention. I told you I had a cold, yeah? Okay. That stems from elsewhere, only occurring after the proper facts and research have been completed. Improvisational assimilative pedagogy offers models only for the purpose of being taken up, altered, and tested against the models that have been taken up and altered that one's peers provide. A teacher outlines, this is quoting a book on jazz improv teaching. A teacher outlines one model in order to teach another, and learners copy others in order to find their own style. In a way, the ontology of improvisation lies within the phenomenology of this overflowing teaching and learning process, thus overcoming its narrow common meaning that reduces improvisation to immediacy, ignoring the mediation used to generate and develop it. Copying and performing are key elements that come from and encourage rumination on why one performance was better than another. Students are not rewarded for offering the correct test of evidence to prove an argument fallible or defeasible, but how they played off what was offered and their attention to the situation and the others in the course. What's funny about this, when I was writing, I thought of many debate rounds that I had adjudicated or I'd been involved in where the logic was perfect on one side, or the reasons were perfectly dismissed on one side, But the feeling of everyone in the room is that the team who had not done that had won. Because they had brought in this great and passionate, it's like, you just convinced me, man. I know you guys did everything right, but they just convinced me. And they go, yeah, I know. You know, it's kind of a bad feeling and a good feeling at once. It's bittersweet. Yeah. This makes the pedagogy of argumentation collective and also dependent on the contribution of others. This is one of my key elements of the role of the universities in our current political economic system, is that that's the role of the universities, to create these kind of connections, and debate can do that. This mirrors the world that advocates will face one day, where community norms and values, forged through exchanges of conflict, will trump the power of identification of any fallacy by an advocate. Those connections will always trump a correct identification and dismissal of a fallacious argument. Like, look to the American Republican debates. That's the only example I really need, I think, for that. Say fallacy, fallacy, incorrect evidence, fallacy, incorrect evidence. Like, but I like him. I like him. He's speaking good. Speaking good. And our adherence to the Platonists makes us hate that. We hate that. But there's the alternative tradition of the sophists, who says we might hate that, but we can't ignore that. We can't just dismiss that as they're stupid. I think it was Chaim Perlman and Lucy Obrecht-Stedeke who wrote the treatise on argumentation. It's called The New Rhetoric in English, but in French it's Le Treatise d'Argumentation, something like that. And that book says you can dismiss your audience as idiots only to the point where you no longer have one, and then you're no longer arguing. Right? If you eliminate the audience, you're doing something else. Maybe you're your audience. Or maybe you're like, they're all those idiots, they wouldn't recognize the truth. I know. Just dismiss them. Right? Like a bad, egotistical professor or something. We live in a society that also feels that argumentation is best avoided, and that its presence is the symbol that there has been an error somewhere. Something has gone wrong. Something is broken. Our students come to us from this culture without much exposure to argument other than this model. Exposure, engagement, and embodiment. These are the first steps in learning argumentation in an assimilative improvisation pedagogy. Exposure. Here's what argument looks like and sounds like. What do you think? Engagement. Riff off of those arguments. Can you make an argument better than that? Can you find the errors in that? How would you correct that argument? And these arguments can come from so many different cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary sources when you want to encourage argument teaching or debate teaching in the classroom. And embodiment. What are your arguments? How can you present them? I want you to embody this position. I think that's one thing that competitive debate does incredibly well, is it forces you to embody many different conflicting positions over the course of a Saturday. Like, you know, you're like a climate change denier, and then you're in favor of nuclear power, and like within the space of 2 hours. Right? It's very strange. Right? So the collecting of these materials, and not just resources improved by an instructor or by a CA, is vital. Improvisation is collecting and ascertaining items of value deemed useless by others. And in the African American community, where jazz was sort of arguably invented, they talk about assemblage quite a bit in books and scholarship that deals with the African American connection to the teaching of jazz and those pedagogies that are vastly different from institutional pedagogies that we see in the United States. Here's a quote from one of these scholars that talks about it on assemblage. Quilt makers, yard decorators, and assemblage artists rescue objects that have been discarded by their original owners who view them as useless. Spare rags, empty bottles, and broken ceramic pieces no longer function as clothing, beverage containers, or pottery, but cultural creators are able to imagine multiple uses for the same object and give them new life through imaginative repositioning. Similarly, musical improvisers constantly explore the hidden possibilities inside conventional notes, chords, harmonies, and rhythms. So, a while ago, I interviewed one of these electronic dance music DJ people, Max Graham, who's Canadian. He does a lot of EDM, they call it EDM, electronic dance music, like Armin van Buuren, these people. They're big, you know, they play these records in front of these big crowds. And I was asking him about some of the sounds in his album, and he was like, oh yeah, we got that sound because I put the chord in the wrong way into the synthesizer. And we were like, that's cool, let's keep it. And this is the kind of thing I think that in an assimilative improvisational pedagogy you're going to get. But if you say, these are the rules, you must learn them, and here's the set of the right arguments, and here's the only things you can say about economics, You're going to eliminate that. You might still get good debates, for sure, but there'll be good debates that are in a limited, collapsing sphere. Nothing new is being added. You know, it's like you have to change the... if debate is an aquarium, you have to change the water once in a while. And it's going to be bad for the fish. Such creativity, like talked about in the bottle collectors, the cultural reappropriators, requires exposure and sharing. One student's experience in arguing might seem to be useless, but in the hands of another performer, it become an amazing piece of advocacy. The point here is to let students, like musicians, explore the material, looking for ways in, ways to make, and ways to unmake the argument. Ascertainment can be fortified through exploration of various theories, such as Stephen Toulmin's model, as tunes that one could riff off of in order to produce the alternative versions of the argument question. For example, something that one advocate plays as a qualifier in the Toulmin model might be altered into a claim or backing or rebuttal or another. The quality and persuasiveness of such arguments is to be evaluated by the situation and the other participants, using the theories and principles of argumentation as a guide. If those are insufficient, they can be critiqued and patched, just as argumentation scholars already do every day. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the importance of listening in improvisational pedagogy and listening in improvisational assimilative debate pedagogy. Listening is something essential to debate, but we don't do it that often. It's a principle of acceptance for argumentation pedagogy. Listening is critical to playing improvised music, as one must listen for where one can add, move in, or alter what is being played. And you see this if you go to a jazz performance, a live jazz performance, you'll see the musicians doing this, where they play a little test, and then they play back, and they kind of riff off each other, and then they pass the solo to them, and then they go. And then they do it, they kind of do this around during the middle of the song. If you see it, it's really quite amazing to see it. I don't know how they do it. But they practice that kind of spontaneity, which is what we want when we teach debate. Here's one jazz scholar speaking about the importance of listening. Listening is an act of deliberation and discernment, a capacity that gets cultivated through experience. Music is an interactive practice. It is a dialogue, not a monologue. There can be no good players unless there are good listeners. Improvisation plays a critical role in creating the capacity for an augmented sense of listening, because at its core, improvisation is an art that opens doors. It creates new understandings of previous and futurity in order to explore hidden possibilities. It privileges temporary and ephemeral resolutions over permanent and set-in-stone closures, recognizing that today's solutions always require renegotiation and adaptation tomorrow as situations and conditions change. Accepting the impermanence and temporality of a good argument or convincing argument is important for the creation of new, persuasive, and vital argumentation. It's important that our pedagogy and practices provide room not only for conceiving of valid and persuasive argument, but the possibilities of the standards of good arguments to come. In dialogue, nothing is good that ignores and trumps what was previously said. Even in disagreement, argumentation is a cooperative venture first and foremost. In this spirit, students practicing the art of debate or argument should be taught the importance of careful listening, not to see if the moves are right or the strategy is as good as it can be, or for what to say, but tactical listening. Listening for what they can contribute, what they can add in notes or key changes, what resonates or is in tune with their collection of stuff they are trying to transform into good advocacy. In short, argumentation pedagogy should teach listening as an acceptance of the presence of other utterances, not for the purpose of rebuttal, not for the purpose of making you look good, but for the purpose of allowing them a space to create a new strategic understanding of argument. So when we teach listening, we often teach the tactical. How do we work within this given ideology of argument to make you win the debate? Instead, what I'm suggesting is that listening can be, how can I riff off of this to raise questions not only about what my opponent has said, but questions about the very form, the scope and scale of acceptable reasons in our society right now, today. That's the move I'm interested in making. So, some final thoughts here before we open it up for some questions. Teaching argumentation from manipulative pedagogy is what I believe to be the biggest concern facing the field of debate and argumentation studies. Assuming that a set of moves and counter-moves will resolve large policy disagreements is futile at best and counterproductive at worst. Teaching argumentation as an improvisational, situational, and rhetorical act as productive can easily fall into the pedagogy of manipulation. Manipulation fails our students as it assumes the set of possible pieces and moves is fixed, and value comes from combination and recombination. You'll hear this if you come to the competition. You'll be like, well, if you get a motion that says regrets, or you get a motion that says should, you have to do these 5 things, and this is what a Western liberal democracy would do. And it's all very limited and manipulative and within a box. It's within a box. As an alternative, teaching debate through the pedagogy of improvisation based on assimilation is a better way to revitalize debate. And it also can explain why publics were much more engaged with debating than they were at the start of this century than they were last century. So this is the 100th anniversary of a wonderful essay that I'm also working on called Is Debate Primarily a Game? It was written by an American. It's like, should we think of this as a game, like a sport, something like that? It's still a question that comes up all the time. Should we think of debate as a sport, or is it something else? Or is that too limiting of a metaphor? It's a really interesting question. It's related, and it's a century apart. We're still dealing with these same sorts of questions. Assimilative pedagogy, understood best through the pedagogy of musical improvisation, teaches students to collect, evaluate, and be mindful of the production of utterances around them, so they can be prepared for the myriad unknowable controversies that await them as advocates in the world. Such a pedagogy can be accessed by activities that ensure the students are co-creators and co-authors with the category of knowledge. They cannot be dutiful learners of the Toolman model, showing their ability to diagram argumentation or locate fallacies from a newspaper. They must assimilate this and other performances into their own repertoire, ready to change the tone, the pitch, or the key, based of and in response to the situation. Instead of critics of argumentation happening out there, laughing at the people in other places, laughing at their inability to think, or laughing at their ability to see the fallacies in their argument or make a decent argument, assimilative pedagogy throws students right into it, seeing themselves as current participants here and now in advocacy, collecting and improvising the tunes of the music that's playing around us right now, the advocacy music playing around us right now, and playing what they think is the best response in the moment for the audience, listening to and concerned by the issues that face us. Thank you for your attention. So I don't know how much time we have, Zofie. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions or comments or discussion about anything that I've offered. And this is my advertising. If you can't think of one now, you can email me too, and I promise I'll respond to you. And that's my website where I have my podcast on debate and my blog on debating. So if you want to read more of this kind of thing, it is available to you for $19.95. No, it's free. Yes, sir.
So I would have a sort of practical question. So the idea sounds very intuitive and very convincing. My question would be, how would you reconcile this with the practicality that in debate, in VP debate, you need some measure of objectivity, and that even with the system that we have today, you have a lot of speakers that feel that there's a high degree of arbitrariness in the evaluation that they get. Do you lose some of that, and what would be some possible fixes to that if we go towards a more fluid model where we don't have very specific fixed guidelines of what we expect in a debate in terms of like style of arguments, type of arguments, and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm a relative newcomer to BP debate. I was first exposed to it in 2004, and I thought, how strange. How strange. That was the first time I went to go see one. And I thought, what in the world? Because I'm used to the highly adversarial, very clean American format, which is based on legal advocacy. And regardless of whether someone's right or wrong, if they misstep a rule, you can have them tossed on that. So it's like an American courtroom drama. You know, we're familiar with these terrible shows, right? Law and Order, Biscuit Unit, Law and Order, Left Rear Tire Unit. They're on TV all the time. So this is a great question because of this desire for objectivity. I think is something we should just give up, actually. And I think that maybe when we say objectivity, we mean something else. I think what we mean is fairness. We want a fair competition, but I think it gets folded into objectivity. So we can talk a little bit about the Malaysia document. Its problems with that document is that what you have is actually a sense of fairness, or here are the tactical moves that worked for us as very well-respected debaters or very well-respected CAs in the international community. And that's great, but what they don't recognize is those moves were only possible because they were given freedom to make them. And they said, this is what worked for us. I think it's a wonderful document, a historical document, and a wonderful sort of autobiographical document. But I don't think it reaches the level of objectivity you need to have a fair competition. Now, the second part of your question, what would the fair competition look like? I think we have a lot of access to the way people judge arguments now by just attending to, for lack of a better word, the public sphere. And I know that this concept, this Habermasian concept, has been beaten up and beaten up and beaten up, but I think for instructional purposes it's nice for the fairness of the competition to imagine what that sphere would look like. And a few years ago you had much more variety in how BP was looked at based on where you went, and I thought that was a benefit to BP. And I think there's a lot of people out there who would like to homogenize and maybe bleach those variants out of BP because they have some larger goal in mind, maybe to break at Worlds or to break at Euros or something like that, which is a fine goal. I have no problem with that. But you don't want to change the entire nature of what you can get out of the competition to get that result. So I think we're looking for fairness, and I think fairness is accessible through looking at the kind of audiences that we would like to be speaking to are evaluating those arguments. And that's implicit in the things that debaters read. It's accessible already. Everyone's obsessed with The Economist. I don't really know why. There's so many better things to be reading, quite honestly. I mean, if you're kind of a conservative European economist, I guess that's their audience. I don't know, but it's weird, and it sets up some weird agency questions about how people make decisions. And there's a lot more rich stuff but those kind of arguments kind of get folded into, well, these people win, and these are good ways of looking at it. These things get folded in. I think we started reaching out a little bit more. We might have the fairness is about accessibility to arguments, accessibility to persuasive arguments, and I think the adjudicators also should be maybe sort of more upfront with their own kind of biases and perspectives. But it should be a fair competition to say, well, that argument is maybe too technical, or that argument, I mean, these things are going to vary a bit. But I think that's one of the strengths of BP debate, in my mind, is that it's not like American debate in the fact that it's cut and dried. And, you dropped the fourth response to subsection C, so you lose the debate. Even though all of your evidence is clear that all of the world's children will die tomorrow unless we pass the policy. Sorry. You forgot to fill out the form. Come back tomorrow, we're closing. It's like the worst kind of Eastern European bureaucratic nightmare, right? But that's American debate. But thanks for the question. I hope I dealt with it okay. Maya?
Hello.
Hello?
I don't have a question. I have an unbaked thought. I would like to evolve debate and its practice as well. But I think that we're not necessarily discussing part of the problem, which I see authority and appeal to authority. Systems get perpetuated when we set certain role models in place, and I think that current adjudicators in debating, in actual competitions, but also in critical thinking in classrooms, they're subject to the one who has the power. In debate is the adjudicator, in the classroom is the professor. The professor who says certain things and expects those things to be repeated in one form or another in oral or written exams. So my question is, how do you challenge this authority, and how do you subject the authority to the evolving model of discussion and debate? Because adjudicators and professors, adjudicators in debate, professors in the classroom, they're not participating, they're imposing. How do you challenge that? How do you change that?
Yeah, another excellent question. Maybe I shouldn't have had Q&A. This is really hard. No, I'm just kidding. This is actually a really good question. Appeal to authority. So this is a classic fallacy question. Appeal to authority. When is appeal to authority appropriate, and when has it gone too far? So appeal to authority. When is it okay to say someone's an authority on something, and when is it okay not to? I think that's a question that needs a lot more exploration and, I guess, explication. But I think in the debate world, everybody wants to be successful in debate, and they want to win debates, and I think there's no problem with that, and I like that too. But I think it's the nature of how we say and how we model as a community what that looks like is sort of the problem. So when CAs say, if you do these things, this is going to lead to winning, that's an imposition. But if they talk more about their process, I think, as somebody who's on the same level or was on the same level or is part of the same genus as the people participating now, they say, when I was a debater, what I used to do was, or what I used to draw from was, I think that might be more constructive of being a fellow traveler rather than someone who's imposing. I think that's important. And I also think in the classroom that the teacher must become someone who is not banking, right? The Paulo Freire critique Pedagogy, the Oppressed of Education is still, I mean, it's not a straw person. Some people read this book, good liberals read this book, nobody teaches like that. Well, unfortunately, there's lots of teaching going on like this, which is regurgitate back to me exactly what came out of the book, or regurgitate back to me the principles that I outlined in the lecture, and this kind of thing. And although there might be a place for this kind of memorization, it certainly isn't good in things that are more assimilative, like I talked about. So one of the ways I've thought about this is to conceive teaching as an impossibility. There's no way I can get you to do the thing that I know how to do, but maybe we can be joint encounterers of a text and analyze it together. So I'm much more on the lines of someone like Jacques Rancière in Ignorant Schoolmaster, that amazing book. If you haven't read that and you teach, this is an amazing book. And he talks about how it's two minds looking at something that is new to them is the best check. You don't need the old master with the long beard saying, aha, the secret, aha, I tricked you. You didn't get the whole thing out of it. Kind of like puffing their chest out thing. All you need is a text or a moment of encounter between two different groups on a text or on an experience that is new to them both, and then you get a lot less of that imposition. Because a critical mind or the critical approach of a mind is one that is the best check, according to that. But I think it's a serious problem. I think imposition and authority are serious problems. But what makes someone an authority in debate is rhetorically constituted. And maybe we might not want to think about judging panels as authorities or saying, this is the best argument, or this is an argument that wins, but saying, in this situation, this argument was the one that persuaded me. I mean, we don't like to say this because of the concerns of objectivity, but I think it's something we might want to go back to saying. Saying, like, that was persuasive to me in this instance with what everyone else said. But it kind of throws people into a panic because then there's no tick box to say, well, I tick these things off so I can win. Oh, man. Everything could be different. Everything could be different. But there's lots of activities like this. Cooking is like this. My goodness. I'm a terrible, I'm so bad. I don't know. I don't even try. But cooking is like this because everything's a little different every time. It's not the exact same kind of brand of flour or sugar that you used the last time, or the temperature's off, or the humidity's off, or the oven is different. But we still tend to make it work. Maybe we should think about it like that maybe more. There's no authority. There's people who have maybe more experience and can then speak to the resources they drew in on those experiences to make it work. I hope that helps a bit. It's a big question. Yes, sir?
You said earlier that you have a problem with first-person emotions, like this house as a feminist regrets would be whatever. Because, as I understood you, you kind of mimic someone in a stereotypical way. I tend to disagree with that, and would be interested in your thoughts on that. Because the way I experience those debates is that they kind of have two layers. In the first layer, people, or two clashes, people present very nuanced analysis about what it is to be a feminist. And this is kind of the first clash of the debate. It's not the first proposition stand up and say, okay, that's like how a feminist would be, and now that's how you're going to debate about. So you always have those first clash, and then you talk about the goals or what you want to achieve in this debate. So I tend to disagree here that people really have those stereotypical views of those persons, but rather having a debate about what it is to be a feminist.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point. Maybe I'm a little bit too, it's a pet peeve of mine or something, maybe. But it also could be quite a serious claim, right? So I'll address it on both levels. Maybe it's a pet peeve, but I would submit to you that if you look at the motion, this House believes that feminists should not support, or feminists should not be against pornography or something. That's some very common sort of motion that you hear determined these days. Versus this, well, I guess maybe I travel in weird circles, but, or this House believes that feminists should not, I mean, I think there's a world of difference there. It's like, as a feminist, would not support, or feminists should not. I don't know, I mean, maybe it's something about the debate community that targets the deeper analysis of the group that you get with the as a feminist motion. But I think that it's too dangerously close to substituting assimilative for manipulative. And the reason why is because then the debate becomes about what it means to be a feminist instead of maybe keeping that open, or maybe keeping that more in play. One has to take sort of a root on that in a way that they wouldn't. Like, they can say, well, as my experience or my point of view, feminists are probably concerned with these things. Is, I think, a little bit of a better way of approaching it than saying, well, feminists have to have these sorts of things in it. Because I think we get too dangerously close to saying the set of what could be a feminist is limited. Or any of these, you see some strange motions like, as a 19-year-old Chinese immigrant to the EU, this house would, da da da, and it's like, whoa. Like, I mean, intersectionality is great, but I don't know if we have time for that kind of analysis in the event. But I do think that there's a way of speaking about it that allows us to put ourselves in it. The key critique from Freeman on the legal ethics question, I think, speaks to this, which is you have to include the participant's own agency and subjectivity in it. They can't imagine or think that this is something that's not connected to them in some way. So I think our position and our response to people who identify as feminists is equally as important as what feminists identify as feminists or respond to other feminists. And that would be my position on it. So it might just be my own pet peeve, and we might get the same debate on both, but I still think that there's this important, really important distinction there about the subjectivity and agency of the debater being left out. And I think that they have to so. Yes?
I actually have a question that's pretty close to this, or maybe almost the same, is that when you mentioned playing roles and how it might actually, if you debate from the perspective of a certain actor, then that might somehow constrain who that actor is or what sense of characteristics the actor holds. But I also feel like that's not necessarily the case, because I think in debate, I always have a bit of anxiety explaining this to new debaters and novices, and I train a lot of novices. I always have a bit of difficulty explaining to them that in debate the goal is not to reach an agreement, but to have as sort of extreme perspectives as possible. So the way I see it is as broad a spectrum as possible, right? And I think that's why it's a good thing, and that's why when you are placed in a role, you're not saying, yeah, we're going to decide now what position feminists should actually hold. We're just exploring the variety of positions that are possible to conceive of within that role, which are all possibly valid.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfectly valid way to approach it as well. It depends on where you come down on the purpose of debate. So some scholars would say debate is meant for the resolution of disagreements, or for the evaluation of a difference of opinion, the rectification of a difference of opinion. That's what the Amsterdam school would say. But also, I like this idea of debate being a place where people take on extreme positions for the evaluation of those arguments in order to give the audience something new, which is more like sort of an atom smasher, CERN, you know, the big atom smasher in Switzerland, kind of model of debate. Like, let's throw these claims against each other and new things pop out that we might not know are in there. I think that's a good model too, but I think most of the time in competitive debate we're looking for who did the best job. I don't know what that means, but I think most people would say persuading an average person. And I think that sometimes you can do that by exposure to large arguments, and sometimes you do that by narrowing the field. It really is situational. It's a good person. In the back there?
On the same question, you said that instead of trying to assimilate into these positions, one should rather consider playing the role of an attorney. How is that being different from assimilation? Because as an attorney, you would still have to think about what it is that makes a feminist. Even though you aren't necessarily proclaiming to be that kind of feminist, you still take a subjective position in defense of that person. How is that different?
Well, my understanding of what Freeman is saying there is that the only role that law students can play when dealing with ethics is as an attorney in the future. And I think that's important because it's like, what is their approach and what is their understanding of the appropriate, fair, ethical way of approaching law? Not as an attorney with 20 years experience, or not as an attorney who believes this, or only takes on these kind of cases, or whatever. Or not as somebody from a community who's been wronged or something like that. Because in his view, those things tend to trump the thing that you're trying to teach or that you're trying to learn, which is, where's my agency and subjectivity in this? I think you're right. I think that if someone could take on the role of a feminist, like an attorney, and say, well, this is just one of the things I am, which is, I think, what you're saying. Or they can say, well, let's explore what it would be like to be this and take it on as sort of a role. I think that this kind of thing, I mean, it can be educational and fun, but I think the problem with it is that it places second the idea of assimilation, that we also have things that we have to say about attorneys and feminists, no matter our position, and we have the ability and actually the necessity to speak about these positions, and we should do so. And it's not just people who identify as feminists who have valuable things to say on that. I do think you're right. I think there's some value that can come out of that, but I think that as an attorney is less of a role play for people in their third year of law school in the U.S. or finishing their law degree in undergrad here in Europe, is that they're already well versed in the manipulative pedagogy of the law. Now they have to take their abilities to make those assemblages and disassemblages and say, what's the ethical way to do them? What's the ethical way to connect them? What's the thing that can be done there? I hope that addresses your question. We might just disagree, but I think it's important to put the assimilative before anything else. I saw another hand somewhere. Go
I
ahead.
have another one. So you mentioned how collegiate debates in the past were able to draw big audiences, and that you think that the sort of letting more improvisation happen in debate could actually help with that. But I don't know, I'm just very, very skeptical about this, or about the ability to make debate popular at all. I mean, debate that, so that you say that, you know, identifying fallacies and pointing them out is obviously not worth it in itself when everybody still likes whatever, you know, the guy who's not afraid to say what the people are thinking is saying.
Right.
But so I really don't see how it could work, because if I look at my previous university, like a minor celebrity from television is going to have a full auditorium of 200 people. A random celebrity who has some sort of fitness regime that he's selling is going to have a full auditorium with 200 people. A government minister and his extreme right-wing opposition are going to have a full auditorium. And if we advertise a debate about whatever, legalizing drugs, or about, I don't know, the EU or something, we're going to have like 20 people tops. And it's not a question of, you know, how the people who then actually debate there talk. I just don't see how you can actually interest people in like current affairs topics unless there's some spectrum involved in the style of the American presidential debate.
Yeah, great question. And I think that speaks to the problem, a generational problem in education, which is the way critical thinking has been taught as it's a skill set. Now you got it. Now you can go and use it. And then the only place where we get it is at the store, grocery store, and economic transactions. The second part of that is that when a debate is presented to people, it's presented as an entertainment venue. It's like people watch to see what crazy thing is said or what crazy thing comes up. So it's not presented as something critical thinking at all, because critical thinking, for all the expertise that's gone into it and all the classroom exercises, I'm talking from like primary school on up, is set as something very, very homogenous to the classroom and very, very staticky when it moves outside of the classroom. It's an exercise one can do as a consumer, is the primary problem of how it's been taught. You're consuming this text, how do you make a judgment about it? That easily slides into you're consuming this or that. As a capitalist consumer, how do you make a good decision? Hooray, you're a good democratic citizen. That's kind of the way it's taught, and that's a big problem with that. I think that the problem is a long-term one that's hard to solve, which is that people show up for those things because they want to be entertained, or they evaluate politics based on entertainment, or how is that true thing going to come out this time, rather than going to it to see how is that going to be represented. You have all kinds of nice art museums here in Budapest. I love them all, but I mean, why am I going to see like a basket of fruit painted again and again? Why do I go and look at it? Why do I do that? It's because I appreciate it as an art, as representation. How is that subject going to be represented? Like all these paintings of old means, people line up and look at them for days. Why is that? It's not necessarily to get information or to get some kind of good thought out of it. It's because people want to go see the variance in the art. And I think that's a way that we need to push debate. But in order to do it, we need to consider critical thinking not as a skill set, but as an art. Is something that's why people go and hear the same songs played by their favorite jazz musician, or they're your favorite artist. Like, you know, Taylor Swift comes to Budapest. She's not going to play new songs, but you want to be there for that event, for that moment where she plays. She's riffing off of herself, is what I would say. Right? So that's the way I want it thought of, and so I think that's one way to make it popular. And if you look to the early 20th century, the way they were making it popular was they were gathering topics and things that were hot and interesting to the larger crowd. Now, there's problems with that. People are like, I don't want to debate about Donald Trump or nonsense like this. I agree, I don't want to either. But there's all kinds of hot issues that are being discussed and debated all over the place that could be incorporated into debate and give people a taste for what it's like to critically approach a problem instead of just shouting somebody down or talking about how messy their hair is or how many hotels they own or whatever. But it's a good question. It's a question of entertainment versus art is where I would put that question. So.
I actually have like 6 questions, but I figured
Oh, God.
I'm going to email you, I promise. But I just wanted everybody to just hear me this once. So I have a soft voice, but so my debate program back in Alaska, we have hundreds of people who come to our debates. We host debates like twice a quarter sometimes. Public debates, we have 500 people selling out months in advance. It's not like debate isn't something people could get engaged with. Alaska's not uniquely educated. It's a fairly like 50 people in the room. So it's not that it's only ever going to be 20 people. You just need to work really, really hard because people have no idea what debate is. So, like, probably the first time you heard about debate, that's how they still feel about it. And also, just the very first question you took, you seem to be talking about it as though you were expecting and preferring for experienced debaters being the judges, and as though that were like the preferable norm that made your question therefore relevant. So I was just curious if that's your default based on what's happening now, or if that's something you think is good and not always be advocated for.
Well, it's not the normative position, I would think. But I think experience is a better litmus than is a set of rules or a set of, here are the arguments that win. So it's not my normative preference. My normative preference would be a variety of different experiences in the world, because my whole position is we need to sort of have a large injection of the world into debating. And I think that for all the success of public debates, I wonder about this nomenclature of public debate and debate. Because sometimes you go to public debates and college debaters will say to the audience at the end, well, if this had been a real debate, what you would have seen, so it becomes like the emergency tone on the television. It's like, if this had been an actual civil emergency, you would have been given instructions about where to go and who to call, and where to pick up clean water and all this stuff. Civil defense kind of sounding board. So I think the nomenclature should change actually, and there should be debates and contest debates. We should actually flip it, because I think what that would do is inject this larger public, because everybody has the experience to evaluate a debate. There's not one person living in a democracy who doesn't have the experience to evaluate a debate. They do it all the time. So why do we not want those kind of experiences in our competition? It's a great question. I think the thing is that it's the tradition of saying, since this is a skill set that accumulates and is in a manipulative frame of understanding, then the best people to evaluate it are ones who have been around a long time and have had more experiences, seeing more rounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a weird way to make a decision about something, because you're actually making the circle tighter about something that should include everyone who should be engaged in being a democratic citizen. And also the larger question of how do you get people to engage in democratic civic participation aside from their role as consumer of it, which is what modern debates do, that the news media hosts, or any kind of debate modeled after televised presidential debates, which is the model that, unfortunately, seems to be spreading to Europe. I have no idea why. There's all kinds of other models. I talked about this already. But I hope that addresses the question. It's not my normative preference. I think it's the preference of the community. But I would like a preference where you invite various... we have this great faculty here. Can we invite faculty to come and evaluate contest debates? Or are faculty only restrained to the public debate, where contest debaters will say, that was a great debate, but in a contest debate, in a real debate, what we would have said is X, which you hear all the time, or I do when I attend these things. So it's an interesting dichotomy. So one solution is nomenclature. The other solution is to take experience and check it against a democratic society rather than a debating society. I hope that deals with it. Are we good? Okay, well, if you have other questions, I'm happy to engage with you on email or listen to the podcast, read the blog, engage with me there. I'm happy to do it. This is my life's work. I love it. And I thank you all for your attention.